Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast, where we're all about Commander, data, and dad jokes. I'm Joey Schultz and I'm joined by my fantastic co-host. He's the most likely person to build a Morbius Commander deck so that he can troll me by constantly saying, "It's Morbin time." It's Matt Morgan. Or is it Matt Morbin?
I ain't gonna do that. I miss me with that Morbius stuff. But actually, I want to tell you, Joey, I was talking to a buddy, and he was very excited because he and his wife were expecting. And I was like, "Oh, that's really cool. Do you have a midwife?" And he said, "No, actually, like she's pretty dang amazing. Like she's carrying my child." So,
wow,
midwife he does not have. So good for him.
Wow, taking some old school lingo and putting it through the Gen Z language filter is a thing that I did not know would happen today. I did not have that on my bingo card at all.
I didn't either. I mean, you pulled out Morbid time with like Magic the Gathering, so I don't think either of us have any leg to stand on.
It's a card now, dude. I don't know what to tell you. At least I didn't Madam Web joke, right?
I don't know why.
Magic's weird right now, Matt.
That one sounds pretty sticky to get into. Yeah.
Let's get into our topic. It's interesting that we would bring up things like Morbius, Madam Web, because last week we had some new SALT score information to go over, and we saw a bunch of interesting data, like the average SALT scores and how people aren't really resonating with things like the Spider-Man set. Well, we've got even more data to go into today, Matt.
Yeah, we do. Well, we wanted to kind of flip it on its head. So we talked about the saltiest cards and everything. And it was super cool conversation listening to both of you get to talk. And then also just like all the new things are popping up. And so we wanted to kind of look at it from the other angle. And like, what are the least salty sets? And what, like, are these sets well seasoned maybe? Or I don't know. But there's so much data that we can get into with the SALT scores that we just couldn't do it in one episode.
Yeah, very, very much. I like that. Are these things seasoned? So yeah, we did see some big reactions reflected in the data from last week. We did see several Universes Beyond sets were near the top of the list of the sets that people did not necessarily care for. We saw stuff like Spider-Man and whatever. But yeah, we do want to get to now the bottom of that list. What cards are showing up as having the least SALT score amongst their cards on average? Matt, should we just get right to the chart and look directly at the numbers immediately?
Yeah, I suppose we should, because I couldn't fathom this top result, or I guess the bottom result, however you want to look at it. Yeah. But we looked at the sets that had the highest or lowest average SALT score among all the cards.
Going up the list from least salty averages to most salty average, we've got Aetherdrift at the very bottom, Tarkir Dragonstorm, then Edge of Eternities, good for it, Duskmourn House of Horror, and Foundation's Jumpstart.
Well, and then coming then in after Foundation's Jumpstart is Ravnica, but the Clue edition, then Dragons of Tarkir, number 8, Shadows over Innistrad, number 9, The Lost Caverns of Ixalan, and the 10th least salty set is Outlaws of Thunder Junction.
Ugh. For a point of comparison and context here, the set average overall for SALT scores across an entire set's worth of cards, we saw that the average was 0.29 for comparison, and the one that was the highest had a 0.6. And I know that doesn't sound a whole lot, but when we're looking at an entire thing of cards, however many hundreds of cards are usually in sets here, these small numbers do actually kind of indicate quite a lot. Oh, and by the way, real quick, for folks who are wondering why we're not using a median, if we use the median, it's a lot of zeros. That's not as interesting of data as we think. So we're going to go with this average instead. Sorry,
I was floored when I saw the least salty set overall being Aetherdrift, which is the set that was probably the most divisive set I can remember since I came back into Magic. The community was so torn on this. So to see that this had a 0.17 average SALT score blows my mind with just how poorly received Aetherdrift was as a set.
I don't know if it was the number one most divisive, but it certainly wasn't well loved.
This set was so divisive. The theme really threw people for a loop. It didn't really do anything cool and everything. And I'm still processing this, that like Aetherdrift is so low because the vibes were so bad. And we've seen people have a pretty guttural reaction to weird art, weird promo, stuff like that too. So I'm still just trying to get over Aetherdrift being the least salty set we saw.
Well, so fun fact, I actually got the chance to hang out with a couple of friends of the show, including Olivia Gobert-Hicks recently. And when I asked people if they could guess what the, quote, least salty set is here, using this metric that we've done here, averaging out all of the SALT scores amongst their cards, Olivia immediately nailed it. One guess immediately locked in Aether And she and I were on the same wavelength here. The reason for that, we think, is because of a lot of apathy. This is a set that a lot of players just didn't pay attention to. So they kind of just don't have any emotional reaction to it at all. And that is a thing to note about the way that we are drawing data here, is that in some ways, these scores are representing emotional responses. So these scores don't necessarily just mean that the cards in a set are well loved. In some cases, they're just cards that people didn't care one way or the other about.
Sure.
The second place, going from the bottom and going back up, Tarkir Dragonstorm had a score of 0.19, which makes it the second least salty of the sets, when taking the average score of all of its cards and averaging all that stuff out. But I think there's a big difference there. Tarkir Dragonstorm was an extremely beloved set. And in fact, also on this graph, we'll see another Tarkir set on there too. Tarkir as a setting and the cards in there, I think people saw those and registered a lot of joy. One of these feels like scores that people saw the cards and they smiled, and the other one is a score that people saw the card and had almost no emotional reaction to it all. So when you say things that are well seasoned, I think that Tarkir is well seasoned.
Yeah,
when
absolutely.
We look at this data.
Yeah.
But when we look at Aether, it seems like it was maybe just a little bit too bland for everyone.
All of the Tarkir sets, I remember every single time, those are super well received by the community. People liked playing on that plane. And I'm going to get ahead of ourselves a little bit here. So we're going to look at, as far as the least salty sets, Tarkir Dragonstorm is the second least salty set with 0.19, like you said, Joey. Number 7 is Dragons of Tarkir, which is 0.22. And then 11 is Khans of Tarkir, which is 0.23. So all of these, 3 of the least salty sets in the bottom 11 are set on Tarkir. I think that says a lot about how much people like playing on this plane. It doesn't break anything. There's no cards that are going above and beyond as far as oh my gosh, why would a card do this? Kind of like Final Fantasy had with Vivi.
Sure, yeah.
I'm not surprised. I figured that when we saw all these scores coming in, Tarkir would be pretty low just because it didn't break anything. People like the vibes. Basically, everything that Aether didn't do is what Dragonstorm was doing.
Yeah, there are 3 sets representing Tarkir here near the bottom of the list. There are also 2 representing Innistrad, Shadows over Innistrad at spot 8 here, and Innistrad Crimson Vow at number 13, actually.
Yeah.
So it seems like the settings of both of those places are things that players seem to really vibe with, is something that I'm taking away here. I think that some love is being expressed by a couple of these numbers. Not for every set here, but I think for those, it does kind of match up.
People would have said there's a lot of hat sets that are very high on the salt scores. Hat sets, I would have totally gone along with it, yes. And that's actually not what we're seeing when we look at the numbers too, which is, it's really surprising me seeing these results.
Well, and that's a really good point to note about what we are observing from these data and the way that this is drawn. Had you just done a poll on the sets that people do or do not like, the results would, I think, certainly look different here, because we see other, quote, hat sets amongst the data here. Aether having that Fast and the Furious vibe, I think, does kind of meet the definition of that hat set.
Yeah.
Or Duskmourn doing 80s horror stuff, also considered a little bit of a hat set. So does Outlaws of Thunder Junction, the Cowboy set.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that's also near the bottom of this list, which is, I don't know, kind of interesting to see that some of those things that do qualify as a, quote, hat set, maybe as a vibe, people sort of tuned out. But then when we look on them at a card by card basis, which is what these data are measuring, then it sort of feels like they had not as quite as big of an impact on people's decks, and therefore they didn't register very much within the voting.
Yeah, I do think that there's some amount of that going on for sure, because when you look at individual cards, you kind of lose the forest for the trees. You're looking at just one tree at a time kind of situation there, where, you look at everything and you see Rakdos with a bandolier on him, then that's going to be a little weird. But I also think that the cards themselves individually, they weren't overly powerful. They weren't game breaking by any means. There were some really good cards for sure, but I don't think that anything was coming in super heavy and had that guttural reaction. You look at Vivi, for example, that gets you all these vibes of holy cow, because there's reputations that come along with individual cards versus the vibes that come along with entire sets of cards.
I want to draw attention to the presence of Foundation's Jumpstart on this list, as well as the Ravnica Clue edition on this list. Those are both very small sets, and it's kind of interesting because near the top of the list, we also saw some sets that were only 40-ish cards or so, and these sets also fit that bill. So just in case folks were wondering whether the size of the set impacts anything, we are seeing the presence of sets that are pretty small on both ends of the spectrum here. By the way, for clarity, we are only counting original cards from each of these sets. We aren't counting reprints. If you want to know more about how reprints would have affected things, we go over that a bit more in the episode last week, so feel free to check that out.
I think people just saw cards in the Salt Scores from the Clue edition of Ravnica and just forgot those were even cards. It was their first time maybe even seeing them, just because that was not widely published. I don't think it was really distributed very well. Same thing with Foundation's Jumpstart. It's a completely different product than regular Foundations, which also like had a pretty like low Salt score overall. And so my inclination is just people weren't exposed to either of these two sets. And so this probably was their first time interacting with a lot of those cards. And maybe if that's the case, then there wasn't a strong reaction one way or another. And we typically see that showing up as a low Salt score.
That's an interesting observation. It isn't unusual for us to see that cards that are famous get bigger votes because of their fame. So that's an interesting theory, and I'm kind of into that. I think that there's a lot of merit to what you just proposed there for sure.
Yeah.
This is a pretty interesting set of numbers. We saw one extreme last week. We wanted to show folks the other side of that spectrum this week. And we definitely want to hear what it is that you think of these numbers too. Are there certain sets that you think the numbers reflect love, or do you think that they reflect ambivalence? What do you make of these numbers? Definitely let us know. Real quick before we get to the next thing that I'd love to talk about with you, Matt. This next one's a little bit of a doozy, to be honest. We've got a couple of shout outs to do before we continue on with the show.
Yeah, we do.
We are so proud to be sponsored by Dragon Shield, who make amazing card sleeves, and they've recently announced their new line of sleeves featuring officially licensed Magic art, including from Tarkir Dragonstorm, the Dragon, and a bunch of new Fetch Land art too. Dragon Shield also has this amazing card scanner app for you to easily sort through and find the value of cards in your collection. It is a super awesome tool. They even carry custom EDHREC sleeves if you're interested in those. So if you do want to get amazing stuff from Dragon Shield, use promo code EDHREC, all lowercase, when you check out to get a discount as you get your new Shieldy sleeves. Again, that is code EDHREC, all lowercase, and thank you so much to Dragon Shield for sponsoring the show.
Well, and if you would like to support the podcast, you can do so in a lot of different ways. One of the biggest ways actually with how the YouTube algorithm has been acting recently, just make sure you like and subscribe to these videos. It is super, super important. YouTube keeps changing how everything comes through. So if you want to make sure that all the podcast episodes are coming up on your feed, make sure you are subscribed and like these videos. It helps more actually than I think most people realize. But also what you can do if you would like to is head over to patreon.com/EDHRECast and get yourself a little something in exchange for supporting us over on Patreon, like getting in the running to being the patron of the week, because we do give a very special shout out every single week. And so this week we are going to give one to a true king, you might say, to Justin King, who made the executive decision and made the law of the land over in his household to go to patreon.com/EDHRECast and support us over there. So Justin, thank you so much for all of your support.
Justin, make sure that you draw an extra card on your end step because you're clearly the monarch.
Clearly the monarch.
Also, you can catch me at the Laughing Dragon event in Tacoma on Halloween. They're going to have a Command Fest, a bunch of stuff for Riftbound, Lorcana, all there in the Tacoma Convention Center from October 31st through November 2nd. I'm going to be there playing some games with viewers and listeners. There will also be some other neat creators there like Olivia Gobert-Hicks, Anna Margaret, Brian Kibler. Laughing Dragon always puts on a good time, so if you're in the Pacific Northwest and want a game, hope to see you there. Okay, Matt, let's get back into our show here. This next bunch of data, like you said, we're flipping salt on its head. We're taking a look at some stuff. Last week, we saw a bunch of the sets that rank on average being pretty high in the SALT scores, and we noticed a slight tendency of Universes Beyond being, present in there. But that does kind of open up this discussion about what it is about certain Universes Beyond sets that people do or don't like. And a common adage throughout the community is that some of the ones that hew a little bit more close to like high fantasy, say Lord of the Rings and things like that, register as like being maybe less of an issue for some of the invested Magic players out there. I wanted to put that to the test. I wanted to see if that is actually reflected in the data. So I've got another chart here for you showing Universes Beyond sets ranked from highest average SALT score to lowest average SALT score.
Yeah.
And I think you'll find the results pretty interesting.
Yeah, the high fantasy setting really helps when you look at the least salty Universes Beyond sets, because they basically are just in kind of an extended Magic universe. The bottom two, we have Adventures in the Forgotten Realms with a 0.24 salt score, and then Commander Legends Battle for Baldur's Gate with a 0.28 score. Those are the only 2 Universes Beyond sets below the average set score that was the 0.29. So just keep that in mind as we're talking about this, because every other Universes Beyond set is above average when it comes to the average salt score that those cards got.
And some of them are very, very slight. For instance, the next one's just ascending up here with a 0.30 is Final Fantasy. So very, very tiny amount of being above average there. Then also at 0.30 is The Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth. And then also Tales of Middle-earth Commander. So Lord of the Rings stuff is just squashed right in there here. And then, of course, Final Fantasy Commander right after that. So we're seeing, again, a lot of those high fantasy settings near the very, very bottom of the list, which I think really does confirm that invested Magic players do seem to enjoy Universes Beyond a little bit more when it reflects the types of things that they're already used to seeing on those Magic cards.
Yeah, well, and the next one it's a weird step, but then Fallout is the next least salty set that we had with a 0.34 score, but also right next to it, Forgotten Realms Commander. So a little bit of a gap between the main set and then Adventures in the Forgotten Realms Commander decks they had come out. But here's where we get into a lot of the kind of predictable sets, with the next one coming up being Spider-Man Eternal with a 0.36 score, and then Assassin's Creed at 0.37 tied with Warhammer 40k Commander. So those 3 in a row, I'm not really surprised. Maybe Warhammer was a little higher than I would have guessed it to be. But Spider-Man, Assassin's Creed, neither of those sets were really well received. I'm not surprised to see them scoring high.
And then, of course, rounding out what we saw last week, Spider-Man, Doctor Who, original Secret Lair cards, Transformers, and Jurassic World all fill up a bunch of the top spots. And we saw, again, a whole bunch of those last week as the highest salt sets. The Jurassic World collection actually being the number 1 highest salt rank that we saw amongst its cards on average. And a lot of those do seem to have the commonality of feeling very worlds apart, feeling indeed beyond the universes that we are accustomed to on our cards. And it did sort of feel to us like people were kind of taking up maybe a few frustrations on the direction that Magic is going by maybe ranking a couple of these cards more commonly as salt score 1s and 2s and 3s compared to just giving random draft chaff a 0 was the kind of thing that we saw reflected there. But I wanted to show the stuff that was near the bottom of the list because I think it's kind of a nice touchstone for us to see that, yeah, there are some of these sets that we've really adopted to be such a beautiful part of the game. Like, we kind of can't stop gushing about how much we like Lord of the Rings and Final Fantasy, and indeed Battle for Baldur's Gate on this show. We really enjoyed that set too. So that was just something I really wanted to kind of hone back in on as well.
Well, and I feel like this is not a very good trend if the Ninja Turtle set that was just announced this past weekend, it's being set in New York City, where Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is set. And if we're seeing any trends for sets that have like a real world location, they're going to rank pretty high on the salt scores there. So probably not something good. Maybe Universes Beyond should have gone a little more beyond, as in like beyond this world that we live in, because maybe there's just not enough separation from what we see in reality versus what we see on these Magic cards.
I am kind of interested in using some of this data, especially the stuff that ranked very, very low, to kind of predict a bit about what we're going to see for the sets that are coming up. Like, I personally found the Edge of Eternities being the number 3 least salt amongst its cards on average. I found that very, very interesting. And I have to wonder personally whether that will affect anything for the upcoming Star Trek set that is apparently scheduled for next year. The commonalities there just being, of course, outer spacey type of things. But I personally bet that the Star Trek thing will reflect a bit more of the Doctor Who types of stuff that we saw, which was
would guess that,
surprisingly near the top of the list. I don't think the cards from Doctor Who are like all that crazy powerful mechanically in game, but the fact that you're seeing the real world actors reflected on those cards makes it feel like suddenly I'm on Earth again. Suddenly my game is not giving me the game moment that I saw. And I think that that's more likely to be the fate that we see for some of those upcoming sets. Then.
I mean, when you sit down to a pod and you see Jeff Goldblum, Optimus Prime, and David Tennant as the commanders of different decks, like that's going to conjure up certain feelings in a lot of players. And this is kind of showing that, and players are giving us a chance to report back into us about those feelings they get when they get that. So Jurassic World, Doctor Who especially, having real world actors shown on these cards, I think they want a little bit more of a suspension of reality when it comes to using this. And a lot of people on our Discord that people can join, they were talking a lot about they want the Magic cards to have some amount of escapism. They want to remove themselves from what they see outside of Magic a little bit more. And that is being displayed very, very clearly when it comes to what are these salty sets that we're seeing, just when it comes to Universes Beyond, because I mean, nobody cares about Drizzt or any of these other Forgotten Realms commanders. Those are ranking very, very low in the results. And so I think that there's a lot to be said for, we want Universes Beyond. That's not in question, but we want them to be a little bit beyond our actual world and get away from planet Earth a little bit more.
Well, there are some people who don't want Universes Beyond, but since we do have it in the game, it's interesting to see the data about what things people do or don't necessarily like or vibe with. And I think certainly an aspect that is expressed here is that Magic does seem to be going through its, this is the ultimate showdown of Ultimate Destiny type of moment. The Funko Popification or Fortnitification, as they say, where a whole lot of recognizable names are just being smashed together, which can in some ways feel like a little bit of a clash. And, you know, looking at other stuff that we see here to reinforce some of our conclusions, we also have upcoming next year the Hobbit set as well. Yeah, I would predict that it sort of follows in the wake of where the Lord of the Rings set wound up, which was near the bottom of the Universes Beyond sets, and it actually has a rate that is extremely close to the regular average Magic set that is within Universe. And I would expect that to follow suit. And in fact, I actually want to linger even more on the Lord of the Rings one being so near the bottom of the list and being so average, because it had cards like the One Ring in it.
Yeah, I was about
to the top of the salt scores.
The fact that Tales of Middle-earth, the fact that Final Fantasy were actually very, very low compared to a lot of the other contemporaries with Universes Beyond, despite having cards like the One Ring and Vivi, is huge. That kind of is a testament to how overall well received these sets were, because they still were set within that high fantasy realm where people can kind of expect to see these on a Magic the Gathering card, versus Transformers, versus all these secret layer drops. Like The Walking Dead, I remember, was kind of the first time we saw something like this, where the Walking Dead cards had an enormous salt score because they were the first time that secret layer cards was the only way to get those cards. They were functionally new cards. And those had a huge, huge salt score when they first came out. And that still is holding true today.
To sum up, and to make sure our intentions here are clear, this is one way to possibly interpret these data, but also interpreting this way is not a justification for judging any people who do like any of these properties.
Absolutely.
Spider-Man or whatever.
Yeah.
We wanted to examine data to see whether or not it supports the vibes that have been expressed in a lot of online discussions. We're looking for trends because it is interesting, but not because we want to make anyone who likes Doctor Who or Lara Croft or anything like that feel uninvited. If you have come into the game that way and you see a lot of the discourse online, it's probably very alienating. So rest assured, no matter how it is that you got into the game, we want to play Magic with you. And we hope that goes for everyone in our audience, because this isn't a player's thing. This is a company thing. And that's why people are interested in it. Like even Wizards of the Coast is interested in it, to the point that they actually released a survey last week asking people how negative commentary affected their purchases. And then they proceeded to ask survey takers to name the creators who had given negative commentary. And in case you're wondering my opinion about all of that, when I tried to fill out the survey, it gave me a screen that said error, something went wrong, and I'm not going to lie, that actually sums up my feelings perfectly. Not to be too sassy about it.
Fair.
Point is, these numbers are just a lens through which we can possibly see players express some concerns, and one of those concerns right now is whether Universes Beyond is pushing the envelope too far and making some cards too powerful, hence Vivi's high salt score this year. Child is the number 3 saltiest card this year. Or how players know that, of course, these crossovers make a lot of money for the company, so of course Wizards will continue to make them, but that doesn't change the anxiety that if Hasbro's conclusion is that pictures of Tifa or Spider-Man on cards will make money no matter what, does that mean that they're going to let their employees and their designers still have enough time to be able to put in the work to keep the game healthy?
Yeah.
When I look at these numbers, I see invested players reacting to the realities of corporate pressures, more noticeably over time, affecting creative direction. I see players expressing worry about the future of a game that they very long held very close to their hearts. That may not be what everyone sees in these numbers, but regardless, we hope you find them interesting. Just like knowing what cards are popular will help you find the unpopular ones, knowing what folks don't love also helps us see the stuff that they do love, and we do see evidence of players being eager to embrace things here. And no matter which cards or commanders that you embrace, the frustrations about corporate stuff should be directed corporately, while we make sure from player to player that we are inviting to each other.
Yeah, no matter how you got to the game, you're here. And that's what matters, I think, is what you're trying to say. As long as you are here, you're welcome. And like, I love Lord of the Rings. And I remember for a while there, people were kind of like, well, like, I don't want Lord of the Rings on Magic the Gathering cards. It doesn't matter because it's still bringing people to the game. And ultimately, the game is bigger than it's ever been. And I'm not saying you shouldn't feel invalid by not liking it, because there are some Universes Beyond sets and secret layers. Like, I love The Office, but I see a Dwight Schrute card and I'm kind of like, what's going on here? Yeah. And so I understand the feeling, but ultimately, like, it is bringing people into the game. And so I'm really, really curious what direction they keep taking and how some of these future Universes Beyond sets are going to be received.
Yeah, I can simultaneously be happy to have more opponents and also raise an eyebrow at some of the decisions that the company is making. I can hold both of these truths at the same time inside of myself. Yeah, I contain multitudes, and that's one of them.
you can be happy that somebody's playing the Dwight Schrute Hey King card, but you also can't be surprised when I put it in a tub full of Jell-O. Hopefully they use Dragon Shield double sleeves.
Amazing. Okay, Matt, we've got even more data to get into on the back half of the episode about the commanders that have risen and fallen the most in these scores. But before we get to that, how about we take a quick break for Challenge the Stats?
Let's do it.
This episode is brought to you by Archidekt, the very best Commander deck building website. We house all of our decks on Archidekt, which you can find linked in all of our episodes, or go to archidekt.com/EDHRECast. And by now, you've probably heard of my favorite feature on Archidekt, dragging and dropping directly from Scryfall or EDHREC right into your deck list, saving you tons of time on typing out your card choices when you're updating your list. And you probably also know that Archidekt's playtester is the very best in the biz, smoothly starting each new turn with a swift draw and untap, easily grouping and tapping things en masse if you need it, making searches and scries super simple, proliferating a bunch of counters with just one click of a button, and more. But did you also know about its playtester logs feature? Archidekt can track stats during your playtests, noting such data as your number of cards drawn each turn or number of mana producers played each turn, so you can see how often you're hitting your land drops or how many extra cards that you draw, and on what turns you're most likely to start drawing extra cards. I just playtested a +1 counters deck to see how much total power it could accrue on the field, and Archidekt tracked for me that I got up to 48 power by turn 6. Such easy access to a detailed recap of your playtests can help you get in tune with how your deck really works, or help you locate its weak spots, and all those little edges and extra bits of knowledge could make all the difference to make you more successful at your next game night. Check out our decks at archidekt.com/EDHRECast, that's ARCHIDEKT.com/EDHRECast, and thanks again to Archidekt for constantly innovating and for sponsoring the show.
Well, Joey, let me get us started this week. So we got an email from Sam Hidman, which you can do out there. Anybody can send us an email. It's just edhrecast@gmail.com. And Sam had a really interesting challenge, and so I wanted to give this a little bit of limelight. So Sam said, I'd like to challenge stats on an Edge of Eternity's card called the Dominion Bracelet, specifically in an Eryximethys, the Slumbering Isle deck. So the Dominion Bracelet, it's 2 mana for a legendary equipment, cost 1 to equip. The equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has the ability to pay 15 mana. And then it says to exile the Dominion Bracelet, and you control target opponent during their next turn. This ability does cost X less to activate, where X is the creature's power, and you can activate it only as a sorcery. So it's kind of a one-time Mindslaver that has some cost reduction baked into it. So Sam goes on to say, the Dominion Bracelet is an extremely powerful payoff with the caveat that the activation ability costs 15 mana. This makes it extremely difficult to execute the preferred play pattern when you cast, equip, and exile the bracelet all in one turn. Eryximethys, though, is tied for the 5th highest base power among commanders, discounting the mana required from 17 down to a mere 5, which you'll always have access to between the lands you need to cast Eryximethys and the mana generated by Eryximethys itself. Despite this, EDHREC says there are a mere 4 decks running the Dominion Bracelet at under 0.1%. As a sub-dollar card, I would expect this to be a fair bit higher. And Sam, you're absolutely right. This is a really, really cheap way to get a one-time effect of the Mindslaver. Dominion Bracelet, it does exile itself, so it is way less abusable, but sometimes all you need is to steal 1 turn from one player. Say I use the Dominion Bracelet and control Joey's next turn. Well, I make Joey attack Dana and take Dana out of the game, and then I kill Joey on the crackback. That's the type of play pattern that sometimes some of these big green decks all they need is just one of those turns like that. So I really, really like this challenge. I'm going to take it a step further, actually, though. Not just Arixmethes, but I think Galta decks absolutely love this. Getting all of the blockers out of the way for an Alpha Strike next turn, Galta decks absolutely should be loving this type of card. So I do like this challenge. So if you are looking for a sub-dollar card that's kind of a 5 mana, make sure your opponents can't block very well next turn, this is a great way to do it, especially if you're in colors that don't normally get to do that very well. So Dominion Bracelet, whether you're playing Arixmethes, Galta, any of those types of decks, give it a look.
Our patrons have actually dubbed this card the Friendship Bracelet, which I think is especially adorable, considering how deadly it can be if you time it right. I really like an Arixmethes. I'd love it in Galta. I'd love it too in Yargle and Multani, which has 18 base power. Yeah. So it's just like free to activate that. But like, yeah, all of those decks are using it at a very low rate. Like it's only in 17% of Yargle decks. And I don't know, you could push that up to a little bit more folks out there if you're playing one of those decks.
Seems pretty good.
Give your commander a Friendship Bracelet. All right, for my challenge this week, we're talking about an overplayed card in Y'shtola Knights Blessed, the Esper commander from Final Fantasy, a 4-mana 2/4 with Vigilance who does 2 damage to each opponent whenever you cast a 3-mana spell, and at the end of each turn, if at least one player lost 4 or more life that turn, you will draw a card. Y'shtola was the runaway, hugely popular legend from Final Fantasy, really took us by surprise, but then again, the internet loves a cat girl, so I should not have been that surprised. She's ranked 17 amongst all commanders right now as well. But there's a card for her that's showing up on her page that I don't love as much as some others, and that's the spell Circle of Power, a 4-mana sorcery that lets you draw 2, lose 2, make a black mage token, and it also gives your wizards +1/+0 and lifelink. This is a cool card, don't get me wrong, but I don't love it here in an Y'shtola deck. I don't think it needs to be showing up in 40% plus of Y'shtola's decks, and I don't think it needs to be one of her most played sorcery cards either. Y'shtola excels as a control-y value engine, able to respond to a lot of stuff at instant speed, so 4-mana sorceries represent, for her, kind of going shields down moments, which I think means that you need to be very choosy about which ones you put into her deck. And this one doesn't work out as being amongst the greats for me in her deck. The mage token is cool, but the average Y'shtola deck doesn't contain a lot of wizards or even a lot of wizard token makers. And not only that, but Y'shtola is not even a wizard. She's a warlock, so she doesn't actually even get the lifelink from this card, which is especially awkward to me. So given that Y'shtola pings people a whole lot and draws a lot of attention to herself, and given also that she already draws you a lot of cards as it is, and given how one of the things that she probably needs the most help with in her deck is win cons that take all of that nickel and diming that she's doing and then help you actually firmly close the door instead, I think Circle of Power could be cut to make room for another card whenever you're sprucing up her deck. So that is going to be my challenge.
Yeah, love it. Well, if you want to grab any of these cards that we talked about today, or any of our Challenger Stats picks, make sure to head over to cardsphere.com to get your hands on all of these and more. It's just our favorite way of turning unplayed cards into played cards, because you're able to convert all of those cards you have laying around that you're not doing anything with, get them turned into cards that you're actually going to be playing, putting them into the deck. So if you want to check out Cardsphere for yourself, head over to cardsphere.com/EDHRECast and get started today.
Matt, I actually just got an Ouroboros in the mail from Cardsphere. I put it in my wants list, and then like within 2 days it was on its way to me, and then another 2 days passed and I had it, and now I'll be able to pay you back for the time that you Ouroboros did, as a hard card to pronounce. But the green one that gets exponentially more and more powerful, you demolished with me with that card the first time you played it. I'm about to pay you back, bro.
I love that card so much, because after like 3 turns on the battlefield, just dump all your dice on the battlefield, and that's how many counters you have.
When you played it, you genuinely took the dice bag at the table and just turned it upside down. And that will stick in my head as a very iconic moment, because here's the thing, I don't think it was enough dice. I think we still needed more dice to represent how much power that thing put onto the battlefield. It's a good card, and I'm excited to finally have one from Cardsphere.
It's a great card.
Okay. Let's get into our next graphs here, Matt. Which would you like to start with? Would you like to talk about some of the commanders that went up in the Salt rankings this year, or the ones that went down?
Well, let's celebrate the cards that people are kind of warming up to, because I do want to celebrate people being able to change their minds and kind of develop different opinions over the course of time. Because I remember Go Shintai of Life's Origin, it kind of garnered some reactions from people, just being a 5-color commander that's just kind of the default best thing to do if you want to play shrines. People don't really love having something that just kind of handholds for them. And so people kind of warming up to Go Shintai of Life's Origin a little bit. The score has gone down over a full half point, from a 1.08 to a 0.55 SALT score, which, again, these don't always seem like that much, but that's a pretty significant drop when you think about it.
Yeah, that cut its own score in half, and that is the biggest drop that we're seeing on this graph here. That commander is the one to have gone down the most. Dropping from a salt rank that was somewhere in the hundreds to now being at salt rank 399. So that is actually quite a meaningful drop off. Another one that we saw drop down a whole lot was the Capitoline Triad, which also saw its score get cut nearly in half, a change of 0.49, because it's dropped down to a total score of 0.42. It's like rank 649 in the salt score, something like that. Capitoline Triad is a little bit unknown. It was an Assassin's Creed commander, completely colorless, that could give you an emblem to turn all of your creatures into base power 9/9s. I've actually gotten to borrow and play this deck before. I find it very enjoyable. This one in particular stands out to me. I kind of wonder here whether maybe a high salt score indicated people's first emotional feeling towards a set like Assassin's Creed, but maybe that's cooled down over time. I'm not sure what you make of a
likely.
Like that.
I think that is kind of the case, yeah, because you look at it, and like we just got done talking about, Assassin's Creed is still one of the more salty Universes Beyond sets, but maybe individual cards have kind of cooled over time. Because Capitoline Triad, I've only seen like one or two in the wild. Now, I did get to see one that was actually, it was a secret commander for an Architect deck building contest that we did a few months back. That was really fun to see. But being colorless, like, you're kind of kneecapping yourself already. And maybe when people see the Capitoline Triad, it's a colorless deck, but at least it's not Eldrazi. So whatever, we can get on board with this. But yeah, anything that cuts its salt scores in half effectively. There's a third one, Gandalf of the Secret Fire, which also dropped significantly because it's under a point. It's just under 0.1. Like it has plummeted off of how salty it is, and Gandalf especially. I think people are finally just looking at him and, yeah, it was originally a secret layer, but I mean, it's still Lord of the Rings. It's fine, I guess, is kind of what the community seems to be going with.
The next two on the list are particularly interesting to me. Yarok the Desecrated jumped down from a 1.2 to a 0.7, and Thalion the Gitrog Monster jumped from a 1.4 to a 1.0. Those are pretty interesting to me. I still feel my own self. I still feel a certain type of way about both of those designs. I feel like a game against those could actually be a little bit like teeth grindy. And to be clear, some of those scores are actually still relatively high. Thalia and the Gitrog Monster is actually at rank 106 overall in the salt scores. So, again, some of these numbers might not sound like a whole lot, but compared against the entire population of all Magic cards, some of these numbers can still be significant. I kind of wonder here whether these were just budged out because so much else got printed this year that it had to be, they kind of soaked up all of the limelight and took all the oxygen in the room. When something like Vivi hits the scene, you stop thinking quite as much about a Yarok or a Thalion, the Gitrog Monster.
They say that perspective is one of the scariest things ever because it keeps changing and it's relative. So people are like, oh, Yarok the Desecrated, that's pretty scary, but not scary compared to a Vivi. And so people kind of let things slide when otherwise they wouldn't have. Because even Thalion the Gitrog Monster, that's a heck of a Stax Hate Bear type of commander there too. That does some really, really mean things. So to see something even like those types of commanders dropping down like they have, maybe it's not necessarily a good trend. Maybe it is for those individual cards, but what does it say about the format overall where they're kind of warming up to Stax and Hate Bears types of commanders?
Well, and that's just it. I'm not even sure, like, does it count as warming up to it, or does it just count as like we're sort of dealing with the tarantulas by inviting fire snakes into the place, and then to deal with the fire snakes we're going to have to invite some other lizard men here to do.
Country fried saying was that, Joey? Jeez.
I'm just trying to highlight, like, I feel like this is potentially something we could look at and notice an expression of like an attitude about power creep. Like, it's hard to even when every commander at the table is a kill on sight commander, what do you do, right? And it does feel like that is more and more common in especially the bracket 3 games that I play these days, where like I look at every single commander and I'm just like, can't let that stay alive. I look at the next person, can't let that stay alive. And I look at the next person, can't let that stay alive. What am I going to do here? I
truly,
feel like a lot of those commanders are meeting that definition here, and that's something that I think is reflected by the Yarok and the Thalia movement here.
But even then, if you look a couple spots lower, Zozu the Punisher, which quite literally punishes the table, these are all just commanders that they hit the battlefield and they just make sure that people's lives get a little more miserable versus just the raw power level. And I think that's kind of where the trend is moving these days. Is people are worried about those game breaking, I'm just going to win the game on the spot type of commanders versus the commanders that are going to knock down, drag out, make sure the game goes slower, or punishes people for doing things, which is a kind of a weird trend because Commander is the format where people want to do the big and powerful things, but maybe those things are getting too big and too powerful.
Honestly, kind of, yeah. I do feel like some of the data that we saw last week does represent that players are responding to not just like mechanically this makes a game a little bit miserable or whatever, but it actually is just like, oh, this is just powerful stuff. My biggest case for that being the fact that Sephiroth ranked higher than Kefka. Kefka makes you discard cards, and Sephiroth has a very powerful Blood Artist effect, but it got a higher salt score. Possibly a reflection on how players feel about pushed cards, not just within Universes Beyond sets, but just like pushed cards in general, and responding to the power of those cards and not just to the game events that they cause to happen, like losing your hand the way that Kefka does. So that's something that I've got my eye on once again with the data we're seeing this week.
I think price also is a little bit of a factor in the Kefka versus Sephiroth argument there, because Sephiroth is pretty expensive. That also probably applies to Vivi as well, because Vivi's not a cheap card anymore because it's just in every format ever. So,
well, give it a couple weeks.
yeah. Who knows where it could end up. But I do think that like there's some amount of price that plays a factor in some of these cards, not all of them, obviously, because a lot of these that were very salty have also been very, very cheap for a long time. But I do think that is a factor to consider, especially when it comes to the Kefka versus Sephiroth specific argument.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good point. I love that analysis. Looking at these commanders, just kind of summing up feelings about stuff that went down. Some of them did spike up a little bit of fear in me. Thalia and Yarok going down. To my eye, they're making room for some of the other stuff that happened this year. But it is nice to see that the response to some of those things like the Capital and Triad or the Go Shintai going down the most, those ones I think did kind of maybe get people's hackles up or something like that when they first saw them, because Go Shintai also felt like it was really pushed and it just becomes the de facto Shrine Commander from here on out. Or the Triad maybe felt like people felt a certain type of way about Assassin's Creed or whatever it is. But over time, it's nice to see things like that mellow. And that is an important point for me when it comes to the stuff that people have a big emotion about today. How are we going to feel about it in a year? Will some of those things have mellowed out? The answer is probably yeah. So I'm curious to see how things develop over the course of the next year,
Absolutely. But also just not over the course of 1 year, but several years. Because if you would have rewound a little bit and asked me 5-10 years ago about Jorah of the Gitu, that's a card that was very, very powerful for a long time, and have it barely even register. It had an average score of 0.05, which is nothing. That is basic lands have higher scores than that. And Jorah of the Gitu going down as low as that is now, that is wild to me. It's just breaking my brain seeing that get so low. But also it did have a significant drop this year too. So maybe people are just looking at Jorah and well, at least it's not Vivi, so 0.
Yeah, no, Jorah probably got a high salt score after getting new time counters from Doctor Who to help her bust out those OP spells even faster, which sounds scary, but I think over time players all realize that she's still very transparent. Those moves are all still very telegraphed, and therefore she's a lot more manageable. And in that same vein, Umbrus had a significant drop this year too. That's the horror commander who exiles cards from libraries, things that historically people don't like, but it has also fallen, as we see on this graph. Ixhel, an infect commander, it dropped too. There are several of these commanders who seem to have experienced lower salt scores this year as players cooled on them, because these commanders look scary when you read them, but playing against them reveals that they still have plenty of Achilles heels that you can poke at, so they're not as fearsome as perhaps they first appear.
When people don't mind infect anymore, that is a problem. That is a problem. And I play infect, but people still are absolutely in the right to think, well, that was an uneventful way of the game ending. Absolutely. And so the fact that people are moving down these infect commanders, that's a problem.
I don't agree with that, but I mean, we don't need to get into it because that would probably be a whole big side tangent. And I've actually already said my thoughts on that kind of thing in other videos. So how about we've got something else that we've got to talk about here, Matt. We've got another cool chart.
Fair.
How about we go ahead and cap off the episode by talking about the commanders that actually went up compared to where they were last year. Which ones were the biggest risers amongst the legends, and why do we think that's the case? I regret to inform you, Matt, that the two biggest risers amongst the legends feature dogs. The puppers were not as popular as we hoped they would be. Sophia, Dogged Detective, and Dogmeat Ever Loyal both went up in their scores by 0.79 and 0.61, going from scores of basically almost nothing to reaching slightly up there into the almost 1.0 territory. Maybe a lot of cat folks were voting this year.
That's the only thing that makes sense. And it's not even like these jumps were small. Like, these are bigger jumps up than Go Shintai of Life's Origin dropped down. Sophia, Dogged Detective jumped by almost 0.8 points, which is a pretty big, like it almost more than doubled.
Yeah.
It went from a 0.06 to a 0.85 score, which is that's huge. That over 10x its normal score, which is just kind of silly to me. And then Dogmeat, I also don't know what happened that made people want to like get mad at Dogmeat. He's a good boy, for crying out loud. But a 0.15 score to a 0.77, which that's also a huge jump. And so I don't know if there's maybe some new decks that were getting created, some new tech that maybe made like Sophia and Dogmeat maybe a little less fun to play against. I don't know, but I'm very, very surprised to see some of these commanders going up as much as they did, because I don't think they were necessarily egregious when we saw them the first time.
I think maybe it could be a response to like, oh, these actually hit a little bit harder than we thought at first. Like, I've played against a couple of Sophia decks, and Sophia with all the clues and pumping up all of your creatures. Clue decks are strong. Treasure decks are also strong. When you're making a whole bunch of extra artifact tokens, the synergies that exist there are quite good.
Sure.
Sophia surprises me a little bit less compared to Dogmeat. I'm just like, he's a good boy. What do you do? But maybe Voltron decks have just been in a little bit of a renaissance or something like that. There are more toys than ever for them to be able to hit pretty darn hard, and Dogmeat's a good way to hit people pretty darn hard. So it could just be that people are starting to respect the power of these commanders a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely makes sense to me for sure. The next one, I was surprised it's on there, because it was literally the first time that I've seen this card when I saw it on the biggest risers here. But Duggan, Private Detective. So it's a 2 and a Simic for a star, has the power and toughness equal to the number of cards in your hand. And then when Duggan enters the battlefield or attacks you, investigate, and you can pay 1 to green, tap him, deals damage equal to twice its power to another target creature, but you only activate it once. Again, I don't know why this is such a riser, because it just seems kind of whatever. It's very mid to me.
Well, Matt, I think really the answer lies in us zooming out here. Let's look at the whole list comprehensively. We saw that Sophia was at the top, and she is Universes Within.
Yep.
But then we had Dogmeat, and then Duggan. The next one's Colonel Autumn, which is also a Fallout card. Yep. Meriadoc Brandybuck, randomly, which is also Universes Beyond. Wilfred Mott, Mr. House, Lara Croft, Ezio, the 10th Doctor. Every single one of the things that I just named is Universes Beyond. I really think that a lot of people were grinding some gears in the Salt votes this year when it came to Universes Beyond stuff, and these happened to be some casualties.
Yeah, you have to go down, and most of these, when you look at the rest of the list, there's only a handful of Universes Within commanders that actually saw a significant rise. So I do like that point, Joey. I think that people are kind of hitting that critical mass of, they see a Universes Beyond commander and they're just going to give it a default score of something rather than a 0 and moving on. I think that absolutely could be something that is in play here.
And it's not like these jumped into the highest spots in the world, but it is just a trend here. A lot of people seem to be expressing a certain frustration, but that is why we wanted to take a look at some of the nicer parts of it too. These are some of the things that went up, but it isn't always just about mechanically how powerful they are. Sometimes it is just a quick reaction to some emotion that people have when they see some of these, because they remind them of the fact that the secret layer sold out before they were able to purchase stuff and things like that.
Yeah.
There are a lot of other emotions that are attached to data like this. And that's important for us to be in touch with, because this is a game where we go to like cozy up and relax and kick back and have fun. And if there are some of those extra corporate fingers that are like getting themselves all over the game time that we're trying to have, that can be a little bit of a bummer. But there are also other examples that we've gone over in this episode where things are kind of cooling down a little bit and things are changing and attitudes are adopting a bunch of extra stuff too. So it's curious to see how these things will change. And I'm also very interested to see how they will continue to change as the universe's beyondification of Magic becomes an even more normal part of things. And as folks who got into the game from those areas also participate in votes like this, So curious things ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Very much so. And I mean, it's only going to get worse. That's the part that, like, if you don't like Universes Beyond, that's what you got to keep in mind too, is we have 7 sets coming out into Standard next year. 4 of them are Universes Beyond. We're going to get so much of that, whether it was the recently announced Ninja Turtles set that we're getting, the Star Trek Universes Beyond set as well. Like there's a lot going on there, and there's only going to be more and more. So I'm going to be really, really curious how that reflects in the data if Universes Beyond kind of outstays its welcome when it comes to the average Magic player, and do these numbers that we're seeing here for cards that are getting more and more salty as time goes on, are these going to be pretty heavily skewed towards Universes Beyond commanders?
I'm kind of curious, going over some of these, are there things that maybe you personally feel like you relaxed your votes compared to where they were last year? When we take a look at some of these things that have shifted or cooled off or heated up or whatever, are there certain attitudes that you personally felt change within yourself as you were doing more of the votes as well? I'm just kind of interested if there was a commander that when you first saw it, you were like, whoa, but then over time you've been like, oh, it's actually just okay.
Not really. I've typically granted, we only do the SALT voting once a year anyway, so I don't have a ton of time to have gut reactions to it. I do know that I've kind of softened up a little bit when it comes to commanders I've never heard of at this point. Now it's just like, sure, I can read it. Like I've never seen it. It was in this set that like, obviously I've heard of, but I've never seen it in the wild. So most of the time it's either going to be a 0 or a 1. It used to be like I would take everything at face value and, okay, this is obviously a very powerful commander. Even if it's not popular, it's powerful or it's doing something I don't like seeing. That so much has kind of shifted for me a little bit lately. So I have kind of gotten a little bit kinder to those unpopular commanders. But other than that, like it's been pretty much the same for me. But I'm curious, did you change any of your own voting behaviors?
I think so. I think when I first saw some commanders like Maha, Its Feathers Knight, or Igra, Eater of All, I saw those, which they have a very transformative effect on other creatures on the battlefield, turning them into base power 1/1s or turning everything else into food, so as to make all of those other creatures a lot easier to kill. And I still don't love that. But when they're in the command zone, I see it coming. It's like, oh, cool. I know exactly what it is that I'm signing up for. And that makes the pregame conversation or my understandings about like what the game is about to be, suddenly my expectations have been set correctly. So I feel kind of okay, actually. I know exactly what's happening. And that was a really nice thing for my opponent to give me that signal about the type of game experience they want to have. So when I first saw those cards, I was a little bit biting my nails about it. But now over time, I'm a little bit like, oh yeah, I know exactly what this is going to be though. So that's maybe one of the bigger standouts for me about a thing that like went from one position and maybe has started to shrink back down in my mind. It doesn't take up so much space as it used to.
And that's just a nice trend, I think, that the format has taken in general, is people putting something in the command zone, they're signaling the type of game. And especially now that we have the brackets, because again, this was the first time that we've had a chance to vote on the SALT scores with the bracket system in mind. And that is something that we really, really need to keep in mind. And now, yes, Vivi had an extremely high score. Turgid, rightfully so, still had a very high score. And I still was going to give Maha a 4. Like, the Maha can kick rocks.
Sure, yeah. This is a personal thing, not a universal thing.
A personal thing for sure. But people putting things in the command zone, that's kind of letting everybody know ahead of time, this is what to expect. And so there's a difference between saltiness as a commander and then saltiness in the 99.
I'm curious to see whether the scores that some of those cards got this year will hold the same next year or not. A piece of me doubts that they will. And certainly know folks out there that regardless of which commander it is that you're playing, I'm probably going to be pretty darn excited to play against it. So we've gone over so much extra data this episode, Matt. I'm starting to wear myself right out.
Same.
I think we got to wrap this episode up. We want to hear from folks what they think about all of this new information, what they expected to be on the top or the bottom of each of these lists. But for now, I think we've got to call this episode to a close and let folks know where it is that they can get a hold of us online.
So you can find me on pretty much any social media platform, whether it's Instagram, Blue Sky, whatever, at Mathimus55. It's all the same everywhere. MATHIMUS55. And don't forget, we are so happy to work with some of the best in the business when it comes to protecting our decks. And that is only because of Dragon Shield. So if you want to get some of the best looking Magic art on your sleeves, protect all your cards, check out Dragon Shield. And when you check out, use code EDHREC when you do.
And you can find me everywhere online, from Instagram to Blue Sky at Joseph M. Schultz. You can find the cast online at EDHRECast. And of course, if you'd like to get access to our Patreon Discord or exclusive content, you can support us over on patreon.com/EDHRECast. Listeners, we'll be back at you next week with even more data and insights. But until next time, remember, EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.